And it is my pleasure to introduce our last session, Building Trust in AI, What Role for Smart Regulation? For this session, our moderator will be Brian Fung once again, who's a technology reporter at CNN. And we will begin the session with an expert talk from Anita Gurumurthy, who is Executive Director and Senior Fellow at IT for Change.
Thank you very much. I think that this is the last session, and so we do see a dip in the enthusiasm. But I think that the previous session with those two flash talks was really extremely interesting, raising some very pertinent questions. So here's my little bit. In discussions on digital tech and artificial intelligence, trust tends to be technicalized. It's seen as a security issue or an issue for data protection. But trust is really the way a social contract shapes civic behavior based on the predictability of systems to serve the public interest. So when we say trust, we mean public trust. And trust in the context of AI is about the purpose, integrity of the AI system. I think that with AI, in many circles that may not be so techno-optimist, the skepticism is really about the innovation-first approach, the solutionism that we see, which has accompanied inscrutable AI models. Outcome distortions in technology in areas like hiring, criminal justice, welfare. I think we've heard of the robo-debt problem in Australia, and more are responsible for direct and indirect harm to individuals and communities. Evidence of the degradation caused by deep fakes and other misinformation to our global information environment and trust architectures also come to mind, not to mention the rise of financial speculation around AI innovation. The AI ecosystem, despite its immense promises, is built not so much on public reasoning and public oversight, but private and opaque logics. So when we think of de-risking or making AI safe and trustworthy, we need to think not only about addressing the technical aspects endogenous to the AI system, it's about enabling a continuous recalibration of the inner workings of the system for alignment with the norms and principles adequate to a just and equal society. This idea of AI and society as being in a dialectic has been written about in the literature quite a bit. So what's AI? What's it really about? And why is its governance so vital? AI is not merely a product, but rather a paradigm that co-constitutes contemporary social, economic, and political relations. As a means of production, its economic value for countries and entities is deeply implicated in trade and intellectual property regimes, and consequently, the competitiveness and fairness of market structures. As the ordering principle of communicative rationality, AI is a determinant of the diversity and vitality of our public sphere and the arbiter of our communicative rights. And within the emerging architectures of democracy, AI tools play a large part in the architecture of government, of civic spaces and infrastructures, including electoral infrastructures. So we are actually seeing that AI tends to really become part of all the social institutions. On the AI economy and AI's role as a factor of production, I'd like to mention two very, very important aspects that tend to get ignored. One is that free trade agreements are often used to deny developing countries the ability to have access to algorithms. This means while data in various services value chains flows out of these countries, developing countries, AI capabilities are retained by transnational firms from richer countries. So invariably, all the free trade agreements, as well as the joint statement initiative in the WTO, are tremendously problematic, including the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, because of which developing countries cannot tax digital corporations at all in order to raise the fiscal base through which they can actually redistribute money and wealth. Secondly, and more insidiously, trade secrets are often invoked incorrectly and misused to lock up aggregate non-personal data, often from public statistical sources. Societal data like behavioral data that may not really qualify for trade secrets are also in the enclosures of big corporations. This means the innovation economy is starved of the raw material needed to build AI. And so the absence of a governance regime for data and AI that addresses questions of the data commons and the enormous social and public value captured in private enclosures is really the roadblock for development and for developing countries. For instance, the Lagos state government has stated that Uber breached a data sharing agreement in the city which required real-time access to trip and location data via back-end API integration just a couple of days ago. These corporations are, of course, law unto themselves, and they would certainly not honor the commitments that they make to local governments in most markets. The recent UN resolution just a week ago in the General Assembly talks about safe and trustworthy AI and underlines transparent, inclusive, and equitable use of AI while respecting intellectual property and privacy. But we do need to look closer, peer under the hood, at the contradictions in AI that arises from a highly skewed anti-competitive regime of data underlying the AI and the way IP is actually used, intellectual property is actually used to kill innovation. There is a global dynamic here of misrecognition rooted in underrepresentation that has been talked about today, but also maldistribution rooted in economic injustice. We are staring at data inequity that inhibits the majority world's right to innovate, the appropriation of the data commons for proprietary AI, and a totalizing control of national public infrastructures, including undersea cables by corporations. This was also mentioned today. There are also questions for regulation about sectoral data, data of peasants and indigenous people in corporate AI value chains. The John Deere example that was given this morning also needs us to reflect on what happens to the documentation of the crop, the soil, and the farm, and how all that data and the ownership of that data and knowledge should be pinned down. Does it go to John Deere, or does it belong to the farmer? Similarly with the health data commons. So what would the meta principles for governance include? The role of public reason and justification for the artificial intelligence. What is the problem? Do we need the AI, and how should data and AI solve the problem? You know, this kind of cornerstone principle of public deliberation around AI. A second principle, if the AI will generate fair economic and social value for the local context. And context here is not only a data field, but a moral vector. We need to focus on regenerative AI, not hollow out local value through homogenizing cognitive tools like Gen AI. The third meta principle, protection and enhancement of people's rights and rights of nature that so many South American and Latin American countries actually have as part of their constitution, the rights of nature. Questions and considerations of ecological impacts have been largely missing from the AI governance conversation, even as its massive carbon footprint looms over the world. Specifically, global governance norms must protect and promote the data commons and the right to knowledge and innovation for all, and urge all of you to take a look at UNESCO's Open Science Declaration, which is really profound. These norms must provide for binding accountability and liability mechanisms to ensure that there is no evasion of responsibility for AI harms by state or private actors. The recent report by the United Nations AI Advisory Group highlights the shortcomings of self-regulation and mentions the need for binding norms enforced by member states. At national levels, we need an independent regulator to tackle everything from risk assessment and risk mitigation to documentation, transparency, proactive disclosure, public domain registers, auditability, and of course, also for the need for post-facto adequacy. What is the meaning of post-facto adequacy? It means that you need to build systems with the capacity to flag relevant information to verify the machine's inferences. And this is the obligation of the state when public authorities record justifications while they use systems. So when something goes wrong, you really need a human trail in order to figure out what may have gone wrong. The European Union's AI Act in its Article 11 tries to come up with some of these computational protocols for AI systems. Human rights need rearticulation in relation to AI to cover social communications, food sovereignty, health, environment, gender equality, welfare delivery, worker employment, taking into account prevailing governance regimes in this area. For instance, the Biodiversity Convention has really been caught in this tussle and contestation around digital sequence information, because it's possible now to reproduce or even recreate organisms because of sequence information. And this aspect of datafication of organisms through DSI didn't used to exist when the access and benefits regime was negotiated under the Nagoya Protocol. So we're actually seeing a situation where existing regimes are being renegotiated or are at least being contested. I think a question of renegotiation is very much in the horizon of the near impossible, given the powers that be. But I think this is important. Next year, in the ILO, there is going to be a deliberation to visit or revisit labor rights in the context of a platform economy. So it's going to be extremely important for trade unions to be at that table. The future of governance needs to be based on civic participation to uphold citizen interest, and AI policy is not a technical issue, and certainly its workings need not be the subject matter only of technical experts. Civic AI literacy is vital and is often a forgotten frontier. And while we talk of PPPs, public-private partnerships, we do not talk about public-community partnerships. For instance, my organization is building a public AI system with a state government in the federal system of India, of Kerala, where with the education department, we are creating a data trust, a stewardship mechanism, whereby the AI about children is going to be owned or co-owned by the community of parents and the school system together. So this is going to be an independent kind of a data and AI system stewarded by the community along with the public school system. So we really need creative alternatives like this. One final word on equitable AI futures. We spoke about debt, and we also spoke about capabilities to meet the AI age. The question is, how will countries caught in debt already make it in the AI age? That is really the elephant in the room, you would agree. Yes, philanthropy has a role, and we are happy with efforts to support skilling, but we are talking about digital innovation ecosystems as the foundational infrastructures of tomorrow, and that is squarely part of the sovereign rights and priorities of peoples and nations. There has been a shocking neglect of public finance needed to build digital public goods. Each time we talk about connectivity, we talk about 5G and 6G, and we talk about privately controlled connectivity architectures. But actually, in developing countries, the grand narrative of Gen AI, or AI led by large corporations, and the normalization of private finance for the profoundly vital domain of AI creates a legitimacy problem. We are not even able to frame the problem correctly, and we are not able to allow alternative imaginaries to enter the picture, like the one with the open street mapping example from the Philippines. This invisibilization and this kind of narrative capture has a cost. It has real consequences for resource optimizing and context-specific public innovation. And we're too caught up with the mythical power of big data models and the discursive power of these big companies. You may have seen this in the news in the last day or two. The self-checkout system used by Amazon in many stores in the US has been called off. Why? Because they used to use this host of cameras and a vast array of sensitive equipment. And while the argument was that this is going to just make it so easy because you don't need tellers at cash machines, etc., thousands and thousands of people were actually employed to simply stare at video feeds to find out who's stealing what from these stores. So, well, it didn't work out because ordinarily you would have provided a job to somebody in the local store, but now you have taken that job away to create some kind of mythical architecture of stores free of tellers, right? So this is a serious issue about jobs, and we see the tail wagging the dog situation. The Global Digital Compact is being discussed in the UN in New York, and we need to make sure that ODA is available for developing countries. And in fact, there is a serious role for the international financial institutions to really redefine their approach to the way in which public finance can be made available. I would like to make a very, very radical suggestion, but I think while it may be unacceptable to the mainstream, it may be worthy of consideration. Just like the climate debate, we may need to introduce ideas of common but differentiated responsibilities in the funding scenario vis-a-vis data and AI. Common but differentiated responsibilities. Well, this may not really be palatable, but for all the data extractivism and data colonization we have seen, just like reparation of debt, we may need to invoke these ideas that may seem radical, but they are perfectly logical. And this is exactly like the vaccine discussion we had some time ago. Just to circle back, the public trust issue can only be solved through a public innovation ecosystem where private enterprise has a central role, but the ecosystem itself is governed by democratic norms and means where AI can promote agency and autonomy and not stifle it. Are we really ready for this shift is the real question. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm Brian Fung again. Welcome to our next panel where we have Anita, who just gave some wonderfully provocative remarks. And we also have Sian Rasdale from who is the Chief Statistician of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office at the UK. And we also have David Satola, who is the Lead Counsel for Innovation and Technology at the World Bank. So please welcome our panelists. Anita, I thought I'd start with you. I think one of the themes that I took away from your remarks were that it sounds like you're saying the business incentives of, AI model developers, could lead to unequal or negative outcomes for, many people, both in the developed and developing world. And you're saying that we need smart regulation as well as, public-private partnerships to ensure that those negative outcomes don't come to pass. What are some, specific ways you think governments could engage on that, and NGOs could engage on that to put pressure on some of these companies?
Yeah. I think the problem with AI is we have far too many responsible AI frameworks and nothing really binding except for the proposed regulation in the EU. So to the extent that we don't really have global norms, it's extremely hard to enforce anything that's binding when countries that are developing are dependent on trade flows, and when data flows are so existential to trade flows. So even till 10 years ago, the share of the digital economy in overall trade was very minuscule, and increasingly and rapidly, I think this is one of the Gill principles, things are really actually rapidly evolving so that the digital economy and data flows are a very large part of the servicification of the economy. So justice or fairness, I think, is only possible when we look at the international political economy of development. And we have really strong rules for data governance, which is indeed the other side of AI governance. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, I think earlier we heard, and this has come up in a number of conversations about AI legislation worldwide, about the sort of importance of promoting explainability of models, right? And so I wonder if you could just sort of dive a little bit deeper on that point and share some thoughts about how governments could propose legislation or what an explainability regime would or could look like.
So there are two ways to look at it. One is that why is explainability possible or not possible? So the techies will tell you that the machine is doing things that they don't really understand themselves. So the machine doesn't understand it itself. So the only way to do things is to make sure that internal documentation systems adopt a certain process. And what we've actually read in the scholarship that comes out of Europe particularly is that it's the documentation that will save the citizen, because at least you can explain why something could have gone wrong, and in terms of post-facto mitigation, you will at least know, what may have been the factors, the weightages, etc., that led to a certain skew in the way in which decisions were made. But there's also another problem. In a court in Buenos Aires recently, somebody stood up and said, was asked because a facial recognition technology went wrong. The business was asked to produce the data, and the vendor just stood up and said, I'm just a business representative of this transnational corporation that has the technology which is overseas. So I will not be in your court able to produce the data that really was used to train the technology. So we're actually talking about we think that these endogenous systems can somehow be set right just by tiptoeing around, these explainability and other questions, but actually the problem is complex.
Mm-hmm. Sian, how does your office use artificial intelligence, and how do you think about discrimination or bias in the work that you do?
Fantastic question. And I think I'd probably start with a very political answer, actually. This is the kind of stuff that we all need to be sharing more of. What are we doing? How are we navigating these issues? And that, for me, has been such a great part of today, is hearing the perspectives of so many different people doing different kind of roles and responsibilities, and their own perspectives on this same problem. Now, for me, in the FCDO, we're doing lots of what I would call pockets of innovation on AI. Navigating the discrimination element is really, really important, but typically we're navigating that firstly by being quite risk averse, right? I don't think we're alone for parts of government, the kind of government system in terms of how we're approaching that. And then secondly, I think one of the key things that we're doing is really talking and learning, right? That for me is so important, that we don't just dive into this, that we understand more what works. We start to really take all those kind of principles that we have from, disciplines like my own as a statistician around how we challenge analysis, just in the same way if I read a research paper, who wrote it, who were they funded by, and taking those same principles of challenge and questioning to new sources of data and information.
Do you have any examples of, the folks you're talking to, or lessons you've learned from those conversations you might be able to bring to this table?
So I think one particular challenge that I see as an analyst or an analytical leader in a government department is that AI tools enable us to do analysis that maybe we've never been able to do before, or far quicker. And sometimes quick is hard when you've been used to working in a slow way, right? I'm used to a process, I'm sort of a brainwashed government statistician where you collect the data, you quality assure the data, you maybe do some external engagement, you maybe consult with users, you produce a publication, you maybe do a little bit of peer review, and then you publish it. But these new tools are like much, much quicker. And I think that one of the key challenges that I found is I need to be far more upfront to be able to ensure that my kind of analytical principles are brought into the kind of work and the approach that's taken.
David, Sian mentioned being risk averse as a government statistician. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the legal risks that some governments may face as they race to use or embrace AI. and how those play out in different places around the world.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pick up on a few points also that Anita made in her opening remarks. So first, I think the question about smart regulation as it's posed up here in the title of this session is really a matter of perspective. And you can slice it different ways. So we've heard about some of them already. If you're an artist and concerned about your intellectual property, you look at smart regulation of AI in terms of IP rights. If you're the defendant in a criminal trial, you're going to look at smart regulation as, are my due process rights being protected? Do I have a way to challenge the black box that is going to render a sentence for me? You can also look at it, which is the basis of your question, on the national rights versus what's going on internationally. There's a huge debate going on right now about whether we need new laws for AI or whether we can use existing laws, data protection, competition, maybe intellectual property. At the international level, there's kind of an arms race going on about who's going to propose the international framework first that's going to be followed. And, Anita mentioned what's going on at the UN. Those proposals being run out of the Secretary General's office are looking at AI regulation very much from a human rights perspective. We have the EU AI Act, which is a risk framework. It's not really a human rights framework. We have the Council of Europe, which is proposing a convention, which is very much from a human rights perspective, that's likely to be approved in the next month or so. OECD has its principles, UNESCO has its principles, and it's quite a crowded space right now, and it's a little bit chaotic. If you're a policymaker, legislator from, it doesn't even have to be a developing country, to try and sift through all of what's out there. Our own research indicates that there's something like up to 300, maybe more, of these frameworks that Anita was talking about. You've got standards, you've got frameworks, you've got principles, you've got proposals for laws. I mean, it's really quite a dense thing to have to sift through. So I think the question of what national governments could expect to confront, especially our member states who are borrowers, is going to be very different than our member states who are donors. So just this week, we saw the U.S. government publish from the OMB a set of guidelines for U.S. government entities. We've seen the MOU between the U.S. and the U.K. So there are some national approaches that are really motivated by industrial policy, frankly, which is going to be a different motivation and a different starting point for considering policy and legislation if you're in a country that will be the object of AI. So it's I don't mean to dodge your question, but it's a very difficult and complex field to try and navigate.
Yeah, well, picking up on the U.S., I think it's been pretty apparent that Congress has had trouble coming up with a comprehensive AI bill. And so we've seen things like the OMB guidance for federal agencies, and that could have huge ramifications for the AI industry because of the government's power of the purse. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, in the event that the United States does not pass some sort of comprehensive AI legislation, and I guess what impact that would have on the AI industry, and then downstream how developing countries pursue their own development agendas, and how the lack of regulation in the United States could affect that.
I don't think I'm quite competent to answer that question about what might emanate from Congress and the impact that would have on the U.S. AI industry. That's someplace I don't really want to go. But I can, based on things that have happened so far, speculate what some of the debates might be, whether it's in the U.S. or elsewhere. There will be tension between the private sector, those who are likely to benefit commercially from the development of AI systems. There will be pushback from different parts of society, and I think what we've seen in other places in the digital economy, starting with internet governance back 20 years ago, was this concept of multi-stakeholderism, and I think Anita alluded to that a little bit in her opening remarks, and that whatever the process is and whatever location it is, whether it's national, international, regional. I mean, the Africa Union right now is contemplating its own set of rules for AI in Africa, is that it both the process and participation and hopefully the result reflects a concept of multi-stakeholderism, that it's important for the governments to be there, it's important for the private sector to be there, it's important for NGOs, CSOs to be there, as well as the technical community and academia. So where that structure and process has been in place, I think the outcomes have been better. I wouldn't say they're good necessarily, but they've been better. And I hope that is a process that applies to whatever venue it is that's undertaking the legal and regulatory process.
Anita, would you like to tag on to that?
Yeah, certainly. I think that given that you really can't bell the cat, which is the binding treaty on transnational corporations is going nowhere. So till you really have a solution about liability, which is where the rubber hits the road, you're not going to be able to fix the problem. So what I think where the hope lies is precisely at national and subnational levels for some governments with gumption to stand up and regulators to do the obvious. So I do think that 10 years ago in India, when this free basics thing was happening, because, at that time Facebook was bundling all these essential basic information and sending it out, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India said, that's illegal. It goes contra to the right to information of people, which should be completely neutral. So if you're providing content that is biased because it's coming bundled with your service, then that's not on. It's anti-constitutional. So then in India, Brazil is stuck with free basics. In India, everybody has the same internet. So if you have data, then what you download depends completely on the way you search, right? So I think that regulators, including competition authorities, the patent offices, you really have to look at a decentralized way by which that system can be contained. It really is chaotic. I agree, and I think it's quite, I think, daunting. What the prospect that faces us is quite daunting. The second thing I think is a solution from the affirmative side. I think it's really important for people to say, well, LLM is one way to go, Gen AI is one way to go, but we will build something that is imperfect, but that suits our purposes. So it might be for our school systems, it may be for our public health systems. We were talking informally. I was quite horrified to learn recently that all of the public health data of a country like Brazil is stored on AWS. So it's quite like that problem of the undersea cables. Suddenly, part of the African continent is, stuck because something happens and a shark bites those undersea cables, Similarly, AWS cloud is holding the public health data of citizens of Brazil. I mean, this is a completely untenable situation, and we really need to do something about vertical integration and through competition law. And it's a combination, I think, of privacy law, data protection and privacy, consumer law, antitrust, competition, etc. One final thing I want to say is the common data spaces of EU is a place to watch. Voluntary data contributions are not going to go very far. So if Nigeria and the government of Lagos can say to Uber and have, pin down a contract and say real-time data sharing, otherwise exit the market. I think that's the way to go, because how else are you going to bell the cat?
I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, and we do have one from the live stream. How do you balance the need for regulations to ensure ethical AI use with the potential risk of stifling innovation? And I'll open that up to anyone who wants to take that.
I'll take a stab at that first. And I think that the first thing I would suggest to the questioner is to unpack that a little bit, because there's a mixture of different things there. There's ethics, there's laws, there's norms, and I think that's part of the problem that we're facing right now is that if you're going to regulate, you're not really regulating ethics, you're regulating something else. It's very hard to regulate ethics. But if what you want to have as an approach from a policy perspective is an ethical framework, then you probably aren't getting something in the end that is a regulation. It's something else. So in that context, I think we need to figure out, and again, probably look at it from the different perspectives of what it is we're trying to do here, what the problems are. The impending AI divide that Anita referred to, the new iteration of the digital divide, is not going to be fixed by ethics, I don't think. And so I think we need to be very careful about what we're talking about. And the problem, I think, is partly due to the fact that of these 300 or so instruments that are out there that are proposed frameworks for dealing with AI, a lot of them purport to be ethical frameworks, and that how they apply the problems that they fix are fundamentally different than you would find in a legal approach.
Just I think postscript, which is, I think it's a more comprehensive idea of ethics, where worldviews of fairness also accommodate economic justice. So maybe ethics interpreted also to include not just bias and discrimination, but even intended bias. So when you code AI, you code with bias so that many more, let's say, women can be targeted in the job market. So we're constantly thinking about parity in terms of statistics, which is to say, you please eliminate, the system of all kinds of bias and discrimination. But sometimes you have to add bias so that there is transformation in society.
Sian, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was going to come at this from a slightly different perspective. Look, regulation is one part of this, but I think also, how do you educate users of data, right? How do you help people to have the tools or the knowledge to be able to really interrogate the data, understand some of the bias themselves, influence what the norms are, and challenge those who are producing the data where maybe it isn't right?
I think one of the big conundrums that certainly we're grappling with here in the United States is, as we, see many AI companies commit to external audits or evaluations, and the government is trying to come up with ways to evaluate and test, AI models. There's really kind of a big question about what exactly that means and what methods and techniques we ought to use and maybe standardize for testing AI models. And I just maybe would put to you that question, if there are particular, principles or techniques or, priorities that you think would belong in an AI evaluation regime that might be adopted by the US or any other country.
I'm happy to jump in first again. So again, I think you have to disaggregate a little bit what we're talking about here. The question assumes a little bit that AI is a monolith, but if you're talking about AI that runs traffic lights, then the kind of testing that you would do there would be qualitatively different than an AI that would do credit scoring or something like that would have an impact on a human. I mean, I'm not saying the traffic lights don't have potential impacts on humans, but bad joke. So I think that has to happen first, is figure out what the testing proposition probably needs to be tailored to the kind of AI system that you're doing. But I think also just looking at the system, even if there's an impact assessment up front and then a continuous cycle of impact assessments during the life cycle of the product, that's great. But then one also needs to look at what the harms are or what the results of that are. And that can be very different than the testing of the system. And so that, might require a little more time to do. I would suggest, as is kind of written into what's going on at the UN right now, that they're trying to frame using human rights not as a negative, but as a positive way of looking at how to govern AI systems that affect people. Instead of saying, "Oh, you can't do that," they say, if you use human rights as a way to ensure that things get done in a certain way, then that can help produce a better outcome.
Sian, did you have something to?
Yeah, I just had one perspective from kind of experiences in the UK is actually how do you equip your kind of existing regulatory system to really be able to interrogate, challenge or set up what is needed for different sectors. How you approach this in healthcare may be very different to education, for example. And, I'm not sure, my instinct here is that as we evolve and learn, that sector-specific type approaches and standards or norms or whatever is appropriate might be the best approach.
Yeah. That actually leads into a fantastic segue to another audience question, which is, are there any frameworks that exist today to hold AI developers, companies, and users accountable for the societal impacts of their technologies?
So also to link up with the previous one, yes, I think that there are two ways to look at testing AI or, looking at harm mitigation or minimization. One is to think about testing as something you would to that system that is technical. The other certainly is about the social environment in which that AI is operating. I think many times in certain contexts, exactly like with recommender algorithms, right? The UK law with respect to children's rights prescribes certain restrictions on ads for children online. Similarly, there is an entire law in China about recommender algorithms and what you can do or not, which is like a cross-section that covers labor, children's rights, and many other things. So building standards for what is not desirable for a society is, I think, part of the democratic process. I think just around COVID, China also brought about this idea that EdTech can never be for profit purposes. And I think it was really a far-reaching kind of an ethical idea that you cannot actually gamify children through EdTech, right? Because that's what's actually happening in a country like mine. We have one domestic monopoly who is now also, I think, gone to the court and claimed bankruptcy or something because a lot of the teachers that work on this platform went on strike because he was working there 14 hours a day and not even paying the minimum wages. So, and one wonders about all the data of children that Byju's has collected. It's a classic case of monopoly gone wrong with societal impacts that are just going to be intergenerational, So in some sense, I think you need sectoral principles and to decide whether AI is admissible, what kind of AI, and then you would be, I think, figuring out the testing is not going to be difficult. Many of these companies have it all sorted out, and I know the big companies will invest a lot in testing. They talk about self-regulation all the time. So they must have a method, right? So you don't need to necessarily streamline that. I think that will get streamlined, and institutional capabilities and maturity has to be built in. And that is going to take time. I mean, that's what the European Union is also saying. In fact, I would like to give the EU Platform Work Directive as a very strong example of the benchmarks of how labor rights are going to be solidified and crystallized in regulation. And once that is solidified, how the testing happens of the algorithmic management is a secondary question that companies will have to figure out, just like the institutions, the regulatory institutions will figure out. It's the way in which you program democracy. How do you do it? You do it.
So I think, a theme of this conversation has been, competition can help ensure that negative outcomes can be avoided, right? And so I think one thing I'm wondering is, what is the state of competition in the AI space? Is it getting better or worse? And I'll leave that, undefined, and I'll let you guys subjectively take that as you will.
Okay. I'm not sure if competition right now is the right word. I think in terms of ensuring fair results that come out of AI, contestability is maybe a better framing. I think it's difficult today to read the news, whether it's online or in a newspaper or television, to avoid something to do with AI. I mean, if you think about where we were a year ago when not everyone was talking about AI all day, every day, we're inundated with AI, and I think so we know who the big players are. We know who some of the emerging players are. We've seen dramas in the boardroom a couple months ago. We're seeing unimaginable amounts of money being invested in certain companies. Anita mentioned earlier about what the impact that this is going to have on real innovation, especially in countries that aren't, in Western Europe, North America, or China. And I think that is a problem, and it will contribute to this AI divide. Is it the right kind of competition? I don't know. Do we in the U.S. and our fairly antiquated anti-competition laws, are they going to be effective? I mean, the last time they were amended was like in the 50s. So do they really fit for purpose today? I mean, I think the current FTC is pretty brave in what they're trying to do to tackle competition in the digital space. Maybe it's enough. I don't know.
I was just thinking, I think we're solving the problem about decentralizing innovation. So competition is one modality to make innovation plausible. Today we have what the economists will call the tragedy of the anti-commons, which basically means that data is held in enclosures, and although it's a resource that doesn't get depleted so it's non-rivalrous, essentially, that my use of X data is not going to prevent you from using that data. However, the very fact that platforms and apps lock up that data, which could actually have multiple downstream uses, creates the tragedy of the anti-commons. So the problem that economists and society are trying to solve is one of opening up the data so that innovation can take place. I think that competition regulation is one of those in order to decentralize innovation. You really need data governance for economic justice. Normally we think of data governance as something that is linked to privacy and data protection, but I think that entire realm of compulsory data sharing, data reciprocity, making sure that one layer of non-personal data, aggregate data, cannot be locked up in trade secrets. So you really need reform in the economy, which is anachronistic at this point in time. So I would say we're solving for a problem of innovation where we are told that there is only one kind of big bang innovation that's delivered to you by the largest of these gods, who sit in North America. But actually, real innovation will happen if, we kind of turn the table and say, or turn the paradigm and say, what else can be done with the data sets at the edges?
Sian, I wonder if, you can speak to your direct experience working in this space, whether, I guess, what your, how you approach the question of control over your data and the extent to which, this data may be benefiting the developers of the AI models, and is there a tension there between their commercial incentives and your mission?
Fantastic question, and I was having this debate with a colleague who is now smiling like a Cheshire cat at the back of the hall. Look, this is a really, really tough one, right? If I put on my kind of hat as a statistician in a government, where we've got a very well developed system, and it's, I wouldn't say well funded, but it's understood why you need to fund it. It's maybe not so challenging, but then I think about when I'm working with NSOs in the global south. And they're on an uphill struggle to secure funding, to make the argument that investing in having an NSO or, and actually kind of the capability or legislation or whatever it is to get their NSO, up to, even relatively low standards is hard. And then we do work to support them to maybe improve census or household surveys or economic data. And then actually the credit for that data and the visibility of it, or even the kind of brand of it, is lost because of the kind of tools that enable a different access point, is a real challenge and a threat. Because how do those NSOs get the credit? How do they get the funding? How do we actually, those of us who are kind of supporting this work and really investing in the ecosystem, also demonstrate the impact? And it, I don't know what the solution is here, but I worry a lot about how you maintain that kind of brand of what an NSO is in this scenario.
We're just about out of time, but before I let you go, I just wanted to come back to a question I asked a panel this morning, which was, we've been talking a lot about the problem of deepfakes, of AI-enabled cybercrime and supercharged fraud and misinformation. To what extent do you think that those problems that are linked to AI will actually make it harder for countries to achieve their development goals? Harder for countries to achieve their development goals.
So I'll take a first go at that. Look, trust. This is all about trust. Right? People need to really go back to those kind of basic principles of where is the information from, triangulate it. Does it make sense, right? But these things are a massive threat. And I think, actually, if we all left this room and spoke to a few younger people, I have 3 teenagers at home. Actually, part of the real challenge and thing that worries me is they do not understand how much of the material that they are seeing online is not true. They've somehow lost that kind of ability to naturally challenge information, to kind of go back to the basics of, does that make sense? And probably I'm not alone here at being regularly quoted facts at me that are definitely, my response is that from TikTok?
That's a Chinese propaganda. Okay. I think we didn't speak today about content regulation, but the question is really in that realm. I must confess I was one of the 12% in the morning in the Slido that said, I'm not optimistic. Because the way things are, we really are looking at a situation where algorithms have gone rogue. So the virality of algorithms is what causes misinformation. It's not bad actors alone. Bad actors count on the virality of algorithms, and those algorithms have a profit motive that's programmed. And I think the probabilistic motives that are programmed for compulsory virality have led to a situation of obscene compromise of public interest. In the neighboring country of Canada, the forest fires took place, and the neighborhood couldn't get information because Meta was at war with the news media and on revenue sharing, and had said, well, we will exit the market if you force us to share revenue. They exited the market, as a result of which civic information about forest fires could not be transmitted to the neighborhood. So we are actually talking about a situation which needs, I think, a different kind of deliverance.
I see we do have one audience question, 2 audience questions. So are we okay to? Okay, so we'll go over a little bit. Please go ahead, and please introduce yourself.
Great. So I'm Peter from the French Development Organization. So thanks so much for this session on building trust in AI. The issue about open source comes on the table. I had discussions with David at the OECD recently. Talking about statistics, in case we receive a request, for instance, from National Statistical Organization, and the objective is to build AI models to leverage on non-traditional data and other sources, right? Will you encourage open sourcing such models and data? And what's your stake on that? I mean, what do you think? Thanks.
So I would come at this. Thank you. Good question. Because this is something that, I grapple with regularly at work. Look, it's about finding the right analytical tool for the problem that you're trying to look at. And some of this is about the quality of the data that you need and what you're going to use that data for. Some of this is about how quickly you need to answer that question. And some of this is about what data you've got available, what capability, and so on and so forth. So, my general view here is if it's the right tool for the job, then absolutely. But equally, as part of that, and particularly with kind of open source data, do you understand the data enough? Do you understand its bias? Do you understand its source? Do you understand some of the underlying issues well enough to be confident that what you're planning to use that data for, it's good enough?
So I'd like to take a stab at that. But Peter, did you read the paper? You did? Okay, good. I'm an open source guy. I've been one of the pioneers here at pushing open source and making sure we use it, and had thought that, open good, proprietary bad. In the context of AI, I'm having to rethink all that, because from the point, and this might sound like a complete perversion, but from the point of view of regulation, it's going to be easier to regulate proprietary systems. If a system is developed and then put out to the market as open, there is no regulation of it. It's out there and the bad guys can get it, to speak to your earlier question. So on the continuum of between open and proprietary, and I think it is a continuum, I'm not really sure where the optimum place is for that, but I am aware that there are problems with both.
I just wanted to add and maybe pose this as a question, because I think I don't know enough, and maybe it's a matter of conversation. I would say that system needs a licensing. It's not a transaction. A request for information cannot be treated as a transaction or a standalone, procedure. The entire institution of open data and statistics in the age of big data requires an institutional framework for sharing. And that requires, like the Common Data Framework of Europe, you really have to insist that the innovation that takes place on that open data be returned back in the form of extra data generated to be pulled back into the commons. You need a complex licensing system which is differentiated by actor. If the request is coming from another public authority, what would be the terms and conditions? If it comes from a small private player, what is domestic private player, international, transnational corporation? It is a licensing system that has to be variegated. It's a new way of thinking about the legality of data use. Otherwise, I agree, there will be a lot of open washing, because you just take away the openness and then you use the data to lock it up in private invention. So the reuse of the data that is regenerated with the invention also has to, with that innovation, also has to be part of that licensing system. The problem with open source is not so much that it is, it's a value that has failed. The problem is, in open licensing systems, the enforcement authorities are absent. So I think with public data sets, we don't have to confront that problem. With public data, you can actually institute authorities who will conduct the business of enforcing that license, otherwise putting a liability clause. to make sure that what is not done by the people with whom you have shared the data, if they have actually not complied, you can actually take them to court. So I think it's a question of evolving a licensing framework for public data regimes which doesn't exist, so that the abuse of that public data doesn't take place.
I think there was one more question here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the panel. Luis Aranda from the OECD. Two quick things. First thing, we spoke a lot about fragmentation, and this is a problem that we dedicate a lot of thought at the OECD to solving. But I just wanted to hear your ideas on how this could be addressed, understanding that each country is different. And number two, looking at the title of the panel, I was surprised not to hear anything on the speed of development and how regulation can keep up with that, smart regulation. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Sorry, on your first question, could you be more specific about what you mean by fragmentation?
Well, we discussed regulatory fragmentation. We discussed, I think David mentioned 300 frameworks, ethical frameworks and other things. This is providing a fragmented space in the AI world. So when we're trying to put things together in an interoperable manner, what are solutions which we can? So fragmentation and speed of, keeping up.
Do you want to start?
Well, I'll take a crack at that quickly. And I think the interoperability is the key word there. A lot of times people seek harmonization. Harmonization's really hard. You get it in certain places in the European framework with regulation. You do get something like harmonization. It gets close to that. So we see that happening. It'd be interesting to see what the quote-unquote Brussels effect is of the EU AI Act, whether it will follow the same path as GDPR or not. But you're absolutely right. The regulation will never keep up with the innovation of the technology. We will be seeing, though, I think, in the next year or so, different proposals for, at the international level, something like regulation. But again, of the models that I've seen, the UN is talking about it. It hasn't produced anything yet. Council of Europe has produced something. It's qualitatively different than what the EU produced. The Africa Union is talking about something for their membership. So we'll see something. But again, it's very, very hard, I think, to try and distill down and synthesize something out of all those things that are happening there that would apply everywhere. So hopefully we'll get to a point, and maybe this is what will be driven by the trade discussion, of interoperability of these legal frameworks. But I think more than that would be fantasy.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have for this session. So thank you to the panelists, and thank you all for being such a wonderful audience.